Thank you. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you to the large collection of different groups that are responsible for inviting me here today. I am thrilled to be here. I'm going to try to keep my presentation short so that we have a lot of time for conversation, because just in the past few minutes that I've been mingling around this room, I have been inundated with amazing stories about Lawrence, about Holyoke, about Puerto Rico right now. And I really want to make sure that we have time to have those conversations, because for me, the most exciting thing about this book finally being out, and it did take me a solid decade of my life to create this work, the most exciting thing about it being out is that it is generating these conversations that I spoke in Lawrence a few weeks ago, I spoke in Haverhill, I spoke in Lowell, and every time I speak, the best part about it is to hear people say, well, what happened with my family is, or what my experience was. And so I really want to make sure that we leave time for that, particularly because in what I've been learning about Holyoke is just fascinating with me. So I would love to leave some time at the end for not only questions, but also for your insights about parallels, differences, distinctions you see between Lawrence and Holyoke. Okay, so let me start by saying I greatly prefer inclusive terms like Latinx, but I'm a historian and historians are slow adopters, as you can tell from the title of the book. So I will unfortunately probably go back and forth between them, and in the book Latinx is not there, so I will focus on both those terms. But the book is a history. It is a history of Lawrence's transition to a Latinx majority city. As many of you know, Lawrence became the first Latinx majority city in New England with the 2000 census. It is now approximately 75% Latinx, mostly Dominican and Puerto Rican. It's the largest concentration of Dominicans outside of New York City. And so ultimately the book is a history of why Lawrence? How did that happen? How did this tiny mill city up on the border of New Hampshire become home to the largest concentration of Dominicans outside of New York City? So that's half of it. The title is Latino City, Immigration and Urban Crisis in Lawrence, 1945 to 2000. So the first half is that immigration, right? Why did the city become home to such a large proportion of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans? But the second half is this urban crisis. And I want to talk a little bit about what specifically I mean by that, because historians use that term in a very specific way. By 2000, Lawrence also had become the poorest city in the state. Now I know that Holyoke sometimes tries to claim that title. Holyoke by 2000 had the highest poverty rate. Lawrence had the lowest per capita income. So they were duking it out for the space of most impoverished city in the state. And rather than taking that as some kind of a natural fact, as many people who speak of Lawrence or speak on impoverished cities tend to do, treat it as just something that, the universe has ordained, I attempt to trace the history of that impoverishment. I really strongly argue that Lawrence is not a poor city. Lawrence was an impoverished city. Lawrence experienced disinvestment as the resources and capital left the city for the surrounding suburbs, predominantly, but also to go offshore. So the book ultimately is trying to interweave these two stories. Why did it become such a major settlement site for Dominicans and Puerto Ricans? And why did it develop such a pronounced economic crisis? And how did those two things combine? So to start with the why did it become such a major settlement site, my emphasis in this book is to say that if you want to understand why a place like Lawrence that had such little opportunity became such a major settlement site, you really have to understand what constrained people's choices, right? We have a myth in this country that immigrants come because this is the land of opportunity. And for some people that is true. But certainly Lawrence and its history challenges that myth. There was very little opportunity in Lawrence. By 1990, Lawrence had a 25% Latino unemployment rate. And so this is at the peak of Dominican and Puerto Rican settlement in the city. There were very few jobs available. So economic opportunity, employment opportunities, educational opportunity, the percentage of Dominicans with a college degree actually declined between the immigrant generation and the second generation, the US-born generation by 2000. So that means people who came for educational opportunities saw their children less likely to finish college than they would have been if they had stayed in the Dominican Republic. So this question of opportunity, Lawrence really makes us reconceptualize what immigrant opportunity means. And so ultimately, if you want to understand why a place like Lawrence that didn't provide that many opportunities, and we'll talk about the ways it did, but that didn't provide conventional opportunities, why it became such a major draw for people, you really need to understand the push factors. What pushed people from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, what pushed people from the place where many migrants first settled, which was New York, what pushed people up towards the region, and then what constrained their choices. Why, for those of you familiar with the area around Lawrence, why settle in Lawrence and not Andover? Right? If you know Andover, it's a preposterously wealthy, beautiful suburb right next to Lawrence, right? So why settle in Lawrence and not Andover? I don't take that as a natural, well, of course, why? How could they settle in Andover, right? The reality is there's a history to why Lawrence provided housing opportunities, and I use the word opportunity loosely there, and Andover did not. And so the book was attempting to trace those histories, to trace what pushed people from Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic, what pushed people from New York, and then what constrained people into the boundaries of the city itself. So in terms of what pushed people from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, I argue, along with Juan Gonzalez, who wrote Harvest of Empire, over there on that table, and many of the books over there on that table, that if you want to understand if you want to understand all Latinx migration, basically, but particularly Dominican and Puerto Rican migration, you have to understand the nature of US imperialism. That ultimately Dominicans and Puerto Ricans left political and economic circumstances that were shaped by the long history of US intervention in those home countries. I think that is overwhelmingly apparent to us now, right now in Puerto Rico, but it is impossible to ignore when you're looking at the era that I'm studying, and particularly when you're looking at Dominican and Puerto Rican migration. So I'm assuming in Holyoke we're all somewhat familiar with the history of US imperialism in Puerto Rico. But let me focus on the Dominican Republic. In the Dominican Republic, as you may or may not know, the US Marines, military occupied the island for approximately 8 years in the early 20th century, creating a new national army that gave rise to Rafael Trujillo, one of the most famous, infamous dictators in the entire American hemispheric sense history, right? Trujillo ruled over Dominican Republic for 31 years. The US supported him even in spite of his brutality, perhaps one cynically might argue because of his brutality, because his iron-handed dictatorial rule prevented the rise of, what's the big fear? Communism. Thank you. Sorry, I forget that I'm not teaching. I'm like, come on, tell me. I know you know. It prevented the rise of communism. After the Cuban Revolution, the CIA, the US government, began to panic that that kind of authoritarian rule might give rise to a revolution in the Dominican Republic. And so they supported the assassination of Trujillo. After Trujillo was assassinated, Dominican Republic got to have its moment of democracy. They elected Juan Bosch, a constitutionalist reformer. They created a new vision for the country that was going to prioritize social development, healthcare, education. Bosch made some enemies in the military. He was ousted in a coup. And then the people on the island rose up to reinstate their democratically elected leader. On the cusp of that successful reinstatement of this progressive, democratically elected leader, the US once again sent in the military, sent in the Marines to squash the uprising. because they feared that Bosch's camp was dominated by communists. And so instead, they supported the rise to power of Joaquin Balaguer, who ruled the island for most of the next 30 years, who dramatically violated the civil and human rights of his opponents, who dramatically, I can't stop using the word dramatically because it is that dramatic, underfunded the health and education systems on the island, and who, to fund the island's development, borrowed lots and lots of money. And so then by the 1980s, after democracy is restored once again to the island, there is still this tremendous, overwhelming debt that comes due. And as the Dominican Republic struggles to pay its debt, the IMF imposes structural adjustment policies, devaluing the peso, effectively eliminating food subsidies, making it so that people struggled to feed themselves. If you were poor or working class, you struggled to eat. If you were middle class, you watched your savings evaporate, right? This was the context in the 1980s where people was considered la década perdida, the lost decade, right? Where people fled the island looking for some kind of opportunity elsewhere. So this is also the era that the Dominican settlement in Lawrence booms. Not because Lawrence offered real economic opportunity, but because the island did not. The island was pushing people out, and Lawrence was one of the few options, right? So ultimately, I'm going to spare you the overview of US colonialism in Puerto Rico, assuming that it is something we're familiar with, but if you're not, ask me about it during the question and answer. I'm happy to recount that as well. So I argue ultimately that the settlement of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in Lawrence is tied to this history of US intervention, that in that sense, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans are not immigrants. Clearly, Puerto Ricans are not immigrants at all. They're US citizens. But even Dominicans are not immigrants in the sense of foreigners. They're imperial migrants. They're coming from one part of US empire to the heart of US empire. One of the quote that I have from a Dominican migrant in Lawrence says, "You know why there's so many Dominicans here? It's because the US has taken all the wealth from our country." And so ultimately, the rise of Dominican settlement in Lawrence is tied to that US shaping of the political economy in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. Many of the Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who came to settle in Lawrence first settled in New York, but New York was having its own troubles in particularly the 1970s, right? Tied to this conversation about urban crisis that I'm about to have. So as people were pushed from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, pushed from New York by the city's own crisis, and they come to the region ultimately looking to rejoin family, looking to find work in some of the mills that are still managing to hang on from deindustrialization. The question then is, why were they so constrained within the city boundaries itself? And that is tied to this other story that I'm trying to tell in the book of urban crisis. So let me pause for a second and reset myself. So then the history of urban crisis is a history that those people who live in and around Holyoke should also to some extent be familiar, right? Urban crisis, we just saw, how many of you guys got to see the movie? Got to. How many people saw the movie Detroit about the riots? Right? The urban crisis has kind of resurfaced in our conversation right now, partly as a result of that movie that highlighted the rioting of the 1960s. What I'm tracing in this book is the impact that suburban growth and deindustrialization had on urban economies, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest. And I want to emphasize that I wrote this book about Lawrence not because I'm from Lawrence. I'm not. I have a little bit of connection to Lawrence, but I didn't write the book because I'm connected to the city. I wrote the book because I believe what happened in Lawrence is illustrative of what happened to industrial cities throughout the Rust Belt, throughout the Northeast and Midwest. I wrote this book because I believe Lawrence shows us much broader processes. So the history of urban crisis then is one of suburban development and urban economic decline. What I write about in the areas around Lawrence, many of you, Lawrence, like Holyoke, right, was an industrial city. Lawrence was an industrial behemoth in the early 20th century. And as the mills began to move to the south, as the mills began to move to Puerto Rico, ironically enough, as the mills began to move offshore, Lawrence experienced urban economic decline. But we think of Lawrence as deindustrializing. We think of New England as deindustrializing. But the reality is that New England as a whole didn't deindustrialize. The industry moved to the suburbs. So as Lawrence was losing its textile mills, as Lawrence was losing its non-durable goods manufacturing, the suburbs were actually building their industry. In the early 20th century, Lawrence was a major industrial center. By 2000, the leading provider of manufacturing jobs was in Andover. Raytheon, places like Western Electric and North Andover, as with the Massachusetts Miracle that many of us are familiar with, as high-tech manufacturing boomed, that manufacturing was overwhelmingly suburban. So in the decades after World War II, city residents left Lawrence in droves. This was the era of white flight. This was the era of suburban boom, the growth of suburban homeownership, and the suburbs around Lawrence exploded. This was an era where it was affordable to buy a home in the suburbs. And it was made particularly affordable because the government massively invested in providing and expanding the mortgage industry and providing opportunities for people to purchase their own homes. In the 1950s, the average working family in Lawrence could afford to buy a home, maybe not in Andover, but in North Andover and Methuen, the other suburbs around Lawrence. By 2000, the average working family couldn't even smell the homes in North Andover. The divide between urban wages and suburban home values in the second half of the 20th century, in the decades after World War II, became, this is so unspecific here, but look at the actual charts, went like this, right? As suburban home ownership just accelerated, home values accelerated dramatically out of the reach of the average working family in Lawrence. So if you think about, so we're talking about the suburbs grew, they attracted middle-class residents from Lawrence, they attracted homeowners from Lawrence, they attracted the industry from Lawrence, and then the other main economic factor that kind of holds the city together is retail. In the 1940s, if you wanted to buy a refrigerator or you wanted to go shopping for a new winter coat, you went to downtown Lawrence, you went to Essex Street. By the 1970s, you went to the mall in the suburbs, right? So the suburbs around Lawrence competed for the backbone of Lawrence's economy. They competed for its middle-class residents. They competed for its industry. They competed for its retail. And the suburbs around Lawrence won that competition. They won the metropolitan competition for economics in the region. When a city loses its economic backbone, it loses its tax base. What do we know what municipal taxes pay for, right? Education. So the schools went into dramatic disrepair. Public safety, fire, police. Lawrence experienced a rise in crime, a rise in arson, right? As a city loses its economic backbone, it loses its tax base, it enters into a state of fiscal crisis, where even if the city wants to fund education, it doesn't have the resources. Even if it wants to put its resources in the right place, the resources themselves are limited. So that specifically is what I mean by urban crisis. I mean the economic impact that suburbanization and deindustrialization had on Lawrence's economy and thereby on its tax base and thereby on the quality of public services it could offer. So ultimately, I'm trying to weave these two stories together. The arrival of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans to a city that was in a state of profound economic decline, and how did that impact Dominican and Puerto Rican experiences? But also then, how did they turn that around? Because Lawrence today is not a city in crisis. Lawrence today is a city that struggles. But Lawrence today is not a city that has hundreds of arsons every year, is not a city that where you can't safely walk down the street. Lawrence today is a city that is reviving through the resources, activism, labor of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in the city and their white allies. So those were the two stories I was trying to tell. How did this urban crisis impact Dominican and Puerto Rican experiences? And then how have they tried to turn the city around? Because for many of the older white residents of the city who were watching the city they knew and loved decline, become blighted, become filled with crime, struggle to pay its bills, struggle to have fire stations and police officers. For many of those white residents, not all, but for many of them, they engaged in a very classic process of scapegoating. And they blamed the Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who were arriving in the city for the city's economic problems. They argued that Latinos had brought poverty to Lawrence. And they believed, many of them, that if they could somehow reverse this migration, somehow convince Dominicans and Puerto Ricans to quote unquote go back where they came from, then they could restore the city to its economic heyday. It was a kind of classic confusion between correlation and causation, right? That at the same time the city was quite legitimately experiencing an economic decline, it was also, for other reasons, experiencing an increase in Dominican and Puerto Rican settlement. That doesn't mean the Dominicans and Puerto Ricans were causing the economic decline, but for many white residents in the city, they made that logical inference. And they began a campaign of harassment, even racial violence, discrimination, marginalization, prejudice, to try to push Dominicans and Puerto Ricans out of the city. So for Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who wanted to make Lawrence their home, not only did they have to struggle against the city's economic crisis, they also had to struggle against, often, the bigotry and prejudice of their neighbors. They had to fight for the very right to try and save the city and reinvigorate the city. So I'm going to read a little bit, if that's okay, and then I'll talk a little more and then open it up to questions. And I want to read because I specifically want to capture, or the part I'm going to read to you is to talk about the early Latina workers who settled in the city. Because similar to Holyoke, the settlement in Lawrence began with a handful of Puerto Rican and some Cuban and Dominican pioneers in the late 1950s and 1960s, and then build from there. And those early settlers in the city were indeed drawn by some level of economic opportunity, and I'm using air quotes for opportunity because certainly when we talk about being exploited in the mills and working long days for low wages in brutal circumstances, it really, to me, it stretches the imagination to call that an economic opportunity. But there were jobs in the early 1960s, in the 1960s. Not only were there jobs, but Latino and Latina workers were actively recruited. They were drawn in the factories in an effort to try to stay competitive with factories that were moving overseas, actively recruited. They said, oh, if you have a cousin, if you bring your cousin, I'll give you a $50 recruiting bonus, right? They actively brought in Latin American workers during the 1960s and in the early 1970s. And then in the late 1970s, those remaining industries collapsed. So that's the part I'm going to read. Sorry. I did fall off the stage once while giving a talk. And And in the same talk, I then leaned against so I fell off the stage, got back on the stage, and then later on leaned against the podium that it turned out was on wheels, and it went rolling back. Terrible. In the 1960s and 1970s, the availability of jobs in Lawrence's non-durable goods sector was a central factor in encouraging Latinos to move to Lawrence. The non-durable goods sector mainly includes textiles, garment, and shoe manufacturing. As the local paper described, often enough to make a family head for Lawrence was the help wanted section of the Eagle Tribune received from a friend. Although Lawrence manufacturers welcomed Latino workers, the work was often poorly paid, unstable, and even dangerous. In this era, increased global competition was undermining the primacy of U.S. manufacturing. As the manufacture of non-durable goods was transferred overseas in search of cheaper labor costs, often to the very countries migrants were leaving to come to the United States, Lawrence's remaining manufacturers were eager to hire Latinos, eager to exploit the same workforce their competitors were exploiting offshore, but without the need to relocate. I'm going to skip a little. Jobs in Lawrence's factories played an undeniable role in facilitating early Latino settlement in Lawrence. These jobs, however, were often poorly paid, unstable, difficult, and dangerous, and they contributed to the profound disappointment that many Latinos felt of the huge gap between the lives they'd hoped to create for themselves in the United States and the lives they actually lived in Lawrence. This disappointment became even more pronounced when Lawrence's remaining manufacturing sector basically collapsed in the late 1970s and 1980s, leading to widespread unemployment and poverty, but also undermining the city's tax base and thus eroding its social services, particularly education and public safety. This transition from bad work to no work is most evident in Lawrence's shoe industry, a sector that specifically employed large numbers of women. Many early Latina settlers in Lawrence worked at the local shoe factories, such as Lawrence Made or Jogal Shoes. Father John de Lamond, who directed a church-based center aimed at helping Latinos settle in the city, recollected hearing about job openings at a local shoe factory. He recounted that he brought a young Latina who was looking for work over to the factory one morning, and the manager hired her on the spot, asking, quote, "Did she bring her lunch?" An Argentinian woman recalled a similar story. She explained that she went to Jogal Shoes, a shoe factory at the corner of Essex and Union Street, with her daughter. She could not understand English at the time, but the owner told her daughter that if she wanted to work, she could start the very same day. I said yes, and that same day I filled out the necessary paperwork. I told him I was an illegal alien, and he said not to worry. Things would work out. She worked adding shoelaces and rubber to the shoes and was eventually promoted to forelady. I'm sorry to giggle at that. It just gives me a little bit of a shiver, this idea. Things will work out. The Lawrence Made Shoe Factory is one of the most important employers of early Latina settlers in Lawrence. With only one exception, every Latina interviewed by the Lawrence History Center who arrived in the city before 1980 and mentioned a job in her interview recalled working for Lawrence Made. While this may be a sampling bias, and while men certainly worked there too, the centrality of Lawrence Made and the shoe industry more generally for Latino workers cannot be underestimated. In 1974, the short-lived progressive Lawrence newspaper, Today in Greater Lawrence, did an expose of Lawrence Made entitled, quote, "New Immigrants in Old Sweatshops." That's where the cover image is from. Offering a detailed window into work conditions at the factory. Today invoked Lawrence's history as an industrial center, but noted the changing times. The textile industry has retreated south, they wrote, leaving the old mill buildings as shadows of what they once were. Unless you happen to be there at 3:30 when the new mill workers are spilling out, and the place comes to life as if the turbines were still running. The faces are Spanish now, high-boned and sleek-haired. Puerto Ricans accounted for more than 40% of Lawrence's Made workforce in the early 1970s. Let me pause just for a second to point out some of the conversation we were having earlier. One of the reasons why I feel that books addressing this type of history are so important is that we have a myth, a persistent narrative that Latinxes in this country are newcomers. And the reality is that this is a history that from half a century ago. Many of the people that I'm writing about are not alive anymore. May they rest in peace, right? This is not a story of newcomers. This is a long established history that Latinos have in this country. And to continually write and talk about Latinos as if they just got here yesterday undermines claims for full inclusion and full rights, right? And so part of the reason why I feel works like this are so central is to remember that Latinos have a tremendously long history in this country, right? From when the US took the northern half of Mexico in 1848, right? The protest slogan, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." That history of US expansion and conquest and the actual carving up, gobbling up of parts of Latin America, Puerto Rico, right? This is the history, a fundamental part of American history. It's not just interesting if you happen to be Latinx. It is all of our histories. It is a fundamental part of the American experience, this history of colonialism, conquest, and the immigration that results specifically from that. So again, I want to just draw attention to the date here. Yet conditions at Lawrence Maid did not reflect a golden opportunity. Quote, "Not one of 9 workers interviewed batted an eyelash about saying their accidents of various sorts and varying degrees of severity all the time, todo el tiempo." One worker explained, quote, "The same guy got hurt 4 times in one day. I see the old man in the bathroom crying, a strong man, an American, maybe 40, muy viejo y muy joven, very old and very young. Each time the machine took a little of the man's finger. The hourly rate on the floor was just $2.15, just pennies above the federal minimum wage and less than what many manufacturing jobs paid in Puerto Rico." Again, economic opportunity? Many workers did piecework. One Italian woman explained that you could make, quote, "a good dollar on piecework if you're fast, if you don't mind conditions. It's a dog-eat-dog rat race. It's kill. It's really kill. If your machine doesn't run, you suffer. It hasn't changed." Workers also complained of the patronizing behavior of the bosses. Quote, They talk hard to us, like, "You gotta do this." They don't say please. They treat us like kids, como hijos, like sons. These were clearly not the circumstances migrants were dreaming of, yet the author argued that many Latinos were resigned. Quote, "It's still harder to make a buck in Puerto Rico," they say. "There are more opportunities here. Now that I've been here so long, I'd have to begin again." One Latino worker explained, "You get used to it, except that you feel old and tired, viejo y cansado." It would be only a partial truth to say that these miserable conditions and low wages were what caused Latino migration to Lawrence and other industrial cities in Massachusetts. Rather, jobs like those at Lawrence Maid were what Latino migrants endured in order to achieve other aims. Low-wage jobs were viewed as a stepping stone to better jobs, improved economic opportunity, and most importantly, better health and education services, a better life for workers and their families. Latinos took the miserable jobs that were available as a way to stay in the United States and eventually gain access to the better life they believed that staying could provide. But many were never able to find work commensurate with their education or training. As one Dominican man explained, "In my 10 months residing here, I've had to work in 6 places. None of these had anything to do with the academic background that I have from the Dominican Republic, but these jobs have permitted us to keep surviving here." The low quality, low wages, and instability of the jobs that Latinos found in Lawrence were far from the American dream. Rather, Latinos were drawn into an industry that was rapidly globalizing, engaged in an international, quote, "race to the bottom." Even these less than ideal jobs in the city's declining manufacturing center were to prove short-lived, as Lawrence Maid was already going through layoffs in 1974, affecting both the day-to-day operations of the factory as well as the hopes of workers to unionize. Today noted, quote, "Dust from machines," one worker says, "is thick enough to choke on." When Lawrence Maid laid off 500 last November, 4 of the 5 janitors for the 5-story structure got the axe. The worker elaborated, "And we have to eat on dirty machines because there's no workers' lunchroom. El polvo es el postre, the dust is the dessert." By 1978, Lawrence Maid was down to just 750 employees from 2,200 a decade earlier. Between 1964 and 1974, 87 Massachusetts shoe factories closed, and the number of leather shoe workers was cut nearly in half. As the vice president of New Hampshire Shoe Company summed it up, quote, "We're exporting our labor-intensive industry abroad." By the early 1980s, much of Lawrence's remaining non-durable goods manufacturing had shut down, provoking the massive unemployment protested in the 1984 riots. As the State Office of Affirmative Action noted, many Hispanics migrate to Massachusetts to pursue employment opportunities, yet many cannot find work, and those who are employed are stuck in low-paying jobs in the secondary sector of the economy with little opportunity for mobility. This threatens to make Hispanics a permanent underclass in the Commonwealth. Indeed, the 1980s were a time of widespread national discussion of whether disinvestment and segregation were creating a potentially permanent, quote, underclass among African Americans and Latinos concentrated in cities from which economic opportunities had fled, entire communities with little hope of steady employment, and thus little hope of gaining the resources for spatial or social mobility. Lawrence's history illustrates well the challenges of migrating to a city only to watch the jobs migrate away. So, as the remainder of those economic opportunities left the city in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the level of white resistance and harassment accelerated. And Latinos didn't begin, their activism, they continued their activism. And what the riots that I referred to ultimately were events in 1984 where the street level quotidian frustration of white residents trying to save their city by expelling Puerto Ricans and Latinos trying to claim the city as a place where they can be safe and be at home and raise their families and have the dreams that had precipitated their moves. Those tensions and frustrations spilled out onto the streets. And the riots wound up being a major catalyzing force for increased Latinx political power in the city as suddenly the state, the federal government, all the media were fascinated by what's going on in the city. Why is this city so racist? Why is the city filled with white people who are talking about sandblasting their neighbors like graffiti? Why is there a race riot happening in liberal Massachusetts in the middle of the 1980s? And what the media did and what state officials did and what federal officials did was, thankfully, went and asked people, which for a historian is fantastic. What do you think about your city? What's going on with your city? How do you feel about your city? What's wrong with your city? What needs to be fixed, right? And again, white residents overwhelmingly focused on how angry they were that Latinos had come to their city. But Latino activists articulated some of the most brilliant and powerful critiques of the spatial effects of racialized capitalism in the United States that I've ever read anywhere, right? They talked about how the jobs had fled. They talked about the suburbs. They talked about the line, basically, that surrounded the city, containing them, encapsulating them into a city from which economic opportunities had fled. They talked about the bigotry from their white neighbors. They talked about their exclusion from political power in the city. They talked about how even the city officials, the mayor, wished they could put them in an envelope and send them back home. Right? They articulated a stunning and powerful critique of the impact that both racism and economic disinvestment had on the city. And from that critique, they began to get the leverage and the organization to transform the city. And so the rest of the book talks about that activism and that ongoing effort to transform the city. Because even as Dominicans and Puerto Ricans won political power within the city, there's still that larger structural problem that the city itself lacked an economic background. And so while small businesses, money transfer, travel agencies, moving businesses, social services, while small businesses reinvigorated the city, certainly, it was not enough to change the fact that Lawrence was impoverished relative to its neighbors. And so ultimately, even as Latinos gained political power within the city became profoundly reliant on state funds to function. And being reliant on state funds means being reliant, as we've seen in Flint, on state oversight and state control. And so that increased political presence in the city, that increased political power in the city, right? Lawrence has had a Latino mayor for a decade now, doesn't translate always into concrete gains for Dominicans and Puerto Ricans within the city, because we still live in a capitalist system, right? Because we still live in a larger structural political economy that is not invested in empowering the poor and working class people who are contained within the boundaries of the city. So I promised myself I would stop by 6:15 so that we could have time for conversations, and I'm sure there's things I've missed. So let me thank you for your attention and open this up for either questions or stories about Holyoke. I'm happy for either one. Thank you. So questions, stories? Yes.
Sorry.
Wait, I saw one over here and then I'll come back to you.
So I guess the thing that I think about most is that Holyoke, particularly Springfield, it is a city of immigrants. You know, there were different waves that came, the Irish, the French, and then so each wave came in. And the thing that I find difficult for some people is you're explaining why it hasn't worked for Latinos. But other individuals, white individuals, will look at it and say, well, we came here and we did this, you just need to suck it up. And so how do you, and it's hard because basically, you know, you could say, well, read that book and it'll tell you why. But how do you engage in a conversation where both sides are respected? Because there is some truth to what each side is saying. But they're not acknowledging the broader history that sort of is causing the problem.
Absolutely.
The man, if you want to say.
Well, you know, I mean, there's, depending on who I'm talking to, I address that. It's a great question, and I get that from when I talk about this work a lot from people who say, but my grandparents made it with no help. So why can't Puerto Ricans, why can't Dominicans just do what we did, right? And so there's a couple things that I emphasize. One, especially in Lawrence, early 20th century European immigrants were some rowdy activists. They made a ruckus. And so when Dominicans and Puerto Ricans agitate or organize or make claims or articulate demands, that's not them doing anything different than what European immigrants did. The other thing I emphasize is that we are in a different economy. It's one thing, and a terrible thing, to be exploited for your labor. It's another thing to not be able to find a job. Or to be able to only find part-time work or only be able to find temporary work. You know, we are in a moment of profound unemployment and underemployment, and we certainly were even more in that moment in the time period that I was writing about. You know, I consider urban crisis to be from 1965 to the early 1990s, was absolutely a time of high unemployment, high underemployment, which we are, you know, so when people say, why can't they just work? Well, most, you know, if there's a 25% Latino unemployment rate, that's 1 out of every 4 workers that is actively trying to find a job and cannot, let alone all people who have gotten discouraged, right? And so that shift in the economy, I think, is a huge difference. It's one thing to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's another thing when there aren't any boots in the current economy. And then the other thing that I emphasize is that actually the children of those early European immigrants were beneficiaries of some of the largest welfare programs in all of American history. The New Deal, right? The GI Bill sent all the children of those European immigrants to college for free, right? The Federal Housing Administration, it dramatically expanded the mortgage industry, which is what allowed those immigrants and their children to buy houses, to move into the middle class. A lot of immigration historians write about the New Deal and the kind of the welfare state that was created from the 30s into the 1960s, right, as being what made those Russian Jews and those Italians who were stigmatized 100 years ago, made them into white people by the 1960s, provided privileges and opportunities for them by the 1960s. And so that, ultimately, the federal government made that generation, 100 years ago, generation of immigrants, if they were from Europe, into white people with all the privileges that come with that by the 1960s. That is the welfare state. From the 1970s on, the welfare state has been in the process of being dismantled, very specifically because of a conservative belief that it benefited the undeserving poor in the inner cities, right? One of the things I'm trying to look at with this story is the way in which anti-Black racism shaped urban policy. And so for Dominicans and Puerto Ricans who arrived in the US in the 1970s, in the 1980s, particularly if they were of African descent, but even if they weren't, if they lived in the city, they were experiencing, to some extent, the legacy, the impact of anti-Black racism that dismantled the welfare state, beginning with, that created mass incarceration, right, beginning with targeting American cities. And so that, to me, that's a huge distinction from 100 years ago. I saw a hand up here and then a hand in the back. Your story. Please.
Can I act it out?
Well, I would love it. Do I have to be the white person in this story?
This is my story. I lived it. I rioted. I lived with, after the riots, I was one of the people the Department of Justice put on the board to watch the police, to stop the abuse. It was my pleasure to see the riots. Hi, man. I was 21 when I walked into Lawrence. We just want you all out of here. We don't care. We don't give a fuck where you came from. But sir, we're educated. We know English. You're all just pigs. People we don't want here. We don't give a shit if you live here and have an education. We just want you out of here. But. I used to cry and go home and sit in City Hall like this for days. Thank you for making it public. I read the whole thing. She did a great job.
Thank you.
Because I've been trying to tell people this happened. And still today, even Latinos are telling me it didn't happen. There were many of us that are not in the book. My home was the same page of the riots. And that was the true story. It was racial. We were being spit by police officers. And at 21, you know what I used to do? I used to stand in corners to watch my young people. Teenagers being harassed by the police every day. They couldn't walk the streets, and if they were crossing the bridge from North Lawrence to South Lawrence, the cops would stop them, even if there was one individual. One day I'm going by, and I saw 4 cops stopping this white Latino young man. I got out of the car. So I had my teenage girls. I said, so what's up, police officer? I'm on the commission of the police department. Why are you stopping him? No, we just want to chat with him. So, yeah? What about? Those days were my good days. What about, police officer? We just want to talk to him. Say, well, he doesn't have any witnesses. So I'm going to stay here and I'm going to become his witness. Jovencito, ¿y tú hablas español? ¿Hablas inglés? No, no English. ¿Dónde está tu mamá? Who's your mother? She's at work. Okay. You let me be your translator? Sure. So you don't answer anything. We're calling you mom. I knew that mom was going to come right over. This young man was doing nothing. So we got the mom there. The police knew I wasn't going to leave. By then, teachers in Lawrence were bad-mouthing our children in front of their children in the schools. They were in the corners, in the hallways, everywhere, talking bad about those Puerto Rican kids who live off welfare. I always pray and thank my mother every day because she was a political activist in New York City with her mom. And I learned it in Puerto Rico with her because she was a historian. And she taught me that Puerto Ricans had gone to war for this country, and for every white man that went to war, 3 Puerto Ricans died. And I was telling all the white men in that city hall all the time, you're not going to take my blood, because we already paid for it. We're staying in this city. But I did have to live with the big cockroaches and the big rat, because they wouldn't rent to us any other place but the places that were like that.
Thank you. Yeah, I moved to the city in 2002, and I started teaching at Gilmet Middle School, a middle school there in Lawrence Public Schools. And I am a white woman, and as many of the teachers there are, much respect to everyone who teaches in the Lawrence Public School system. But there is a way, as I'm sure many of you know, that white people talk to other white people as if we all share the same ideas. And the things that I heard other white teachers say about our Dominican and Puerto Rican and Latinx students absolutely shocked me. And honestly, that's what made me start to write this book. And I don't like to necessarily talk about that because I didn't write this book out of a personal story, but that sense of outrage is what made me start to look into Lawrence's history. And then as I learned more and more about it, exactly what you're describing, those twin sensations, that fear that you're describing, that so many people in their oral history interviews talked about, that sense of fear and that sense of rejection and that sadness and that disappointment motivated me to tell this story, but also that anger, right? I've had, the reality is that for every person who felt cowed by the bigotry in Lawrence, there were 5 who felt infuriated and enraged and went out and protested. And that activism is what transformed the city. I have, when I talk about this work, a lot from both white and Latinx residents in Lawrence, I have people who are a little concerned that I emphasize the bigotry. Because I do write about that a lot. I draw attention to this store closed to all Puerto Ricans signs that were put in the window of a sandwich shop. I emphasize
Everywhere.
the school committee member who said that the U.S. introduced Puerto Ricans to shoes, right? I highlight the offensiveness, the bigotry, and I have people who say, well, why do you do that? Why do you draw attention to that negativity? Why don't you just talk about the positive stuff?
Because
But to
we
me-
need to heal. And by you telling our story, we heal.
And really, you know, that to me, the positive stuff is what has been built in spite of that opposition. If there's no struggle, oh, good, you had privilege, a nice time, that's a lovely story. What is phenomenal to me about the story of Lawrence is that people fought in spite of all that.
We were Puerto Ricans. You know, when you talk about Dominicans, they came in way after that.
Yes. Well, I mean,
Let me tell you, and the Puerto Ricans, we knew our history because one of the things that, and I'm going to open this up with you, right?
well, before you do, can I just get to the one quote that I wanted to share, and then we can open it back up a little bit more? Because ultimately, the quote that I fixate on that is the Puerto Rican activist Isabel Melendez, who said, you know, let me tell you, if I had been a coward, none of what you'd see would exist, right? And she wasn't just talking about herself, she was talking about activists in general in the city. But just that idea of how many times I was told to go home, go back where you came from, and I always answered, I came here to stay. If I had been a coward, none of what you see would exist, she said. And really, if you had been a coward, if the people who have transformed the city had let themselves be cowed, let themselves be chased out, pushed out, by the bigotry, by the harassment, Lawrence would not have been transformed. And there's an activist in the early 1990s who said very clearly, if we were, hypothetically, to go back where we came from, this would be a ghost town. Because Lawrence already by 1980 had lost 40% of its white residents. Lawrence had already lost its retail. Lawrence had lost its economic background. That happened before the major waves of Dominican and Puerto Rican settlement really hit the city. And so this idea of, if I were a coward, Lawrence wouldn't have been saved, right? So that's just the quote I wanted to draw back to. If you want to open it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to check something out about the history of polio. My impression between the two cities, and my mother was, my brothers and sisters were born here in Holyoke and Springfield, way before I came to Lawrence. So I've always wanted to know the parallels that you're talking about. My observation, and I don't know this, I want to be clarified. The Latinos that came to Lawrence came directly after the hit of the sugarcane in Puerto Rico. We were forced, an economic force. The Boston Sugarcane Corporation decides to leave Puerto Rico with the sugarcane. We have an economic collapse, we come here. Most of us didn't know English. I had a 4th grade English. I was fighting, but my English was 4th grade. Now, my sense over there was that we were fighting because we had just come on the ship and we were like so grassroots that nothing was changing us. My interpretation of Holyoke has always been, where did the Holyoke Latinos come from? Did they come generally from New York City to here? Because we came right from Guayama and Ponce.
I think I remember hearing something that what's Carlos Vega talked about?
Carlos Vega.
Yes, and he talked about initially it was, they didn't come to Holyoke, they came to Springfield. And it had something to do with the housing that these people then had to move to Holyoke. Why, under what conditions, I can't remember exactly, but it was Springfield first, he said. And because I've seen some of the stuff that he's put at he's passed now, but he put at the Wisteria Hearst Museum, and it talked about why there was funding given to move people from Springfield into Holyoke. I can tell you, my family, it was the mills, it was the sewing. They came here because that was what they learned they could get good money that way, but I don't think that's everybody's story.
Did you come from Puerto Rico directly to here or from New York?
I came directly here.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I'm fascinated by parallels, stories about Holyoke, but other questions as well. Yeah.
I don't have so much of a question, just kind of food for thought. I'm Dr. Mia Chandler. I'm one of the new pediatricians at Holyoke Pediatrics. I am 500, maybe 600 years removed from the motherland, all right? But I was born in Germany, parents are in the military. Identify as African American, but if you look at my genetic composition, I've got Italian, Native, but my phenotype is pretty darn brown, all right? With that being said, food for thought. Where did we all come from?
Africa.
Where?
Africa.
Eastern Africa. The earliest remains of the current human form, Tanzania. Does that mean anything? What is race? This probably will not be surprising to any of the Latino people in here. My grandfather, closest resemblance in here, I don't see, but probably looked like a Jewish man. Grandfather, right? That's not surprising, right? So what is race? If he didn't have a little bit of swag when he walked, and if he didn't speak a certain way, you would never know. It's a social construct. So this thing of white supremacy is a false thing, you know? You spoke on that when you mentioned when German and Russian Jews came here, they were able to assimilate into whiteness and forget their culture, forget the ethnicity, and then they got into this disease of whiteness and blackness and brownness and whatnot. So as long as I feel like this, and I'm glad that you wrote this book so that we can have more public discourse about these realities, root realities. But as long as we keep referring to one another as separate, whiteness, blackness, somewhere in between, without respecting the cultures and think that we're different, the disease of racism will continue to perpetuate itself. Food for thought. Food for thought.
Other questions? Holyoke stories, comparisons? Yeah. Were you designated? Sorry, yes, and then?
I'm gonna pass.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'm just interested, were there any voices in Lawrence of people that were white that dissented with this main message of get them
of
out
course.
of here?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Sorry, she put in the names.
Okay,
I am so happy. And they were all true.
You know, I mean, one of the fascinating things about this story is that even when, you know, so one of my, again, I keep coming back to my favorite quotes from the interviews that were conducted, right? And one of my favorite ones, there's two that work together. A lot of people pointed out when the riots happened that Lawrence whites, overwhelmingly working class or poor people, were getting this hugely, were giving themselves, but were getting a hugely bigoted reputation. And yet, the suburbs, Andover, North Andover, Methuen, that were overwhelmingly and remain to this day overwhelmingly white and middle class, were exempt from the conversation. And yet it was the suburban emphasis on exclusionary housing, on only providing single-family, owner-occupied housing, that limited, that, one, created an economic crisis in Lawrence and limited all the poverty into the city boundaries. And so people, ultimately, it's not that the white people who were living in Lawrence were more racist than the people in the surrounding areas. They were just the ones on the front line of this forced intercultural experience, effectively. And, as one person said, the people who live in the projects don't have the luxury of token liberalism. They either really believe in brotherhood or they hate. And so even as the media was there exploring all this hate, the camera consistently was like picking up in the background like a little white kid and a little Hispanic kid sitting together, fishing together, like all these different, interactions, all these different working class interactions between white and Latino residents in the city. I came to the city because my son's father was born and raised in Lawrence, and the product of a Dominican mother and a white, that interesting Lawrence mix of Portuguese, Italian, French-Canadian father, who had met in the 60s and fallen in love and had a child. At the height of what should have been this era of animosity, there was this clear interpersonal love, because love, of course, happens always and doesn't follow these rules of political economy and these rules of race, right? And so even there are absolutely on a quotidian level examples of interracial friendships, right? Loves, alliances. There were absolutely Nuncio DeMarco was an Italian American who was a longtime ally for Latino community in the city. The Immigrant City Community Housing Corporation that became the city's first CDC was made up of an alliance.
I was the one doing it. There was two of us only, a white boss and me. We built 175 units of housing. That was my thesis for my master's degree in economic development.
Wow, yeah. So as the city in an urban renewal effort in the 1970s tore down a huge portion of a neighborhood north of the Common, and then even though they were required by law to build an affordable housing component, the city elites decided, no, what they needed to do was build middle-class housing to bring rich people back to the city, like if you build it, they will come kind of model. That if we can make this housing really expensive, that'll make rich people want to live here, was the city's idea. And so you had organizers who came together and said, that's ridiculous, people were displaced to create this project and they have a right to housing, affordable housing, and the city mobilized, white and Hispanic mobilized together to create.
I mobilized them alone. No city was there, nobody. I was knocking on every single door in that city. A lot of people naked answering the door. It was me. And I always tell people, you're not erasing me from history.
So the short answer is yes, absolutely.
And Len's name is not here, though. Len,
Ultimately,
he was the boss. He made it happen.
The records I got for that initiative were from Armand Hayat, who was the lawyer involved in that. So I looked through all of his records. So the thing about writing about a small city, which many of you who have, it's why I'm so excited about this Holyoke project, is that in small cities, especially small cities that are under-resourced, as Lawrence was throughout the period I'm writing about, things get thrown out. And so I wanted to start this project, and I went to City Hall and I said, okay, where are the mayor's records archived? And they're like, oh, they take those home. I was not even able to get official city budgets for every year of the study that I'm looking at. I had to kind of collect them together from the Lawrence Public Library, the Lawrence History Center, the City Hall. Things were, thrown out, things were missing. I mean, it's really, and I don't blame Lawrence. Clearly, I'm writing about how the city's tax base was demolished. I understand that they weren't prioritizing archival work, right?
They were burning it. What were they doing?
But a lot of what I would, one of the things I write about is that the story I was able to tell here was based on this access to the archives that I had. I did oral history interviews, I used oral history interviews, but ultimately I told the story that was reflected in the sources that I had. And this book took me so long because I did,
Yes,
8 years of research. And the saddest thing is that now that it's out, wonderful people are coming up to me and telling me, I've got a story for you. And so there's going to have to be some kind of revised edition. People have given me all sorts of new archival material, all sorts of new stories to tell. It really is a partial story based on the sources that I had access to. I make no claim to have told the definitive history of Lawrence. I hope it is the first of many books. I'm sorry, I saw your hand before, so let me come back to you.
My name is Montelco, and I'd like to thank you for being here this evening. I'd like to thank the board. And very interesting. I'm a native New Yorker, live in Springfield. Been to Lawrence, but don't know the history of Lawrence. So in my mind, as I travel from New York City to Springfield, Holyoke, and Lawrence, I wonder if there's any similarities. For instance, I spent 20 years in the military. At times, I still feel like I'm a second-class citizen. Based on the fact that life is what life is. And understanding the bigotry, I don't think that's going to change. But I think that maybe as we progress in conversation, I like to keep hope that that reality and that respect along the way will be there. So I just want to thank you publicly.
Thank you.
That the citizens of Holyoke and those who attend this thing here, we've been actually fighting since the American Revolution, so it's nothing new. Before that, I mean, Puerto Rico, so we've always been in a fight. So there's no news in regards to what we're able to do. It's in history. So sometimes when I feel people are like the NFL and the conversations and the Democrats against the Republicans, I think back to school days, and it hasn't changed. So I just want to maybe in conversation say that hopefully things will change along the way, because I think we can do more together than be divisive. And I think divisive is basically the education that we get along the way. And the assimilation process, right? I'm pretty fascinated by it because there's a different word called acculturation. So we were to acculturate. Maybe we can respect people's differences and what they've been through and have some empathy along the way. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastically important point that you're making, and that I believe you, to some extent, were making as well, that racism is constantly being reinvented. And racism, white supremacy, creates race. Race doesn't exist until white supremacy creates it. And racism creates race. As a historian, I am constantly battling with my students against a myth that they hold of progress that I believe renders people passive. If you believe that as time passes, things will just get better, then you don't have to do anything but wait. Freedom will arrive, right? And I personally, as a historian, have seen that actually when you're passive, things can get much worse. And that while we are waiting for people to recognize we're all one, there are people creating new systems of oppression and exploitation. And so I absolutely appreciate hearing that this is a conversation that people feel needs to be heard, because I feel it's a conversation that needs to be had. Yes.
I just want to quickly share, because a couple people mentioned it. If you don't know and you're from Lawrence, I get to visit there a couple times a year. When you drive out of here and you head back towards 291, look at the streets you're crossing, and you're going to see Dwight Street, and Appleton Street, Cabot Street, and Jackson Street, and just the way you see them in Lawrence, because those are the same investors that built both cities.
Yeah.
At the same time, with the same design, canals right down the line. And you can also look at that complete parallel in labor history. When you look at the Breads and Roses events, in the early 20th century in Lawrence. That stuff was going on in a smaller scale here because we're a smaller town. But the parallels from our beginning to where we sit right now are straight down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Every city that I travel to, that I speak in, that I visit, has a distinct story. And yet again, I didn't write this book because I think Lawrence is unique. I wrote this book because I think Lawrence is the American city. I think it tells every important story that you need to know about the late 20th century in the United States. I believe that it absolutely typifies, to me, the most important things to know about the late 20th century is the impact that suburbanization and deindustrialization had on urban economies, the way that then the conservative movement used urban crisis to dismantle the welfare state, the dramatic rise of migration from Latin America. These are the most important developments of the late 20th century, and they are hyper visible, obvious, unavoidable when you look at Lawrence's history. So I really firmly feel that yes, I'm sure there are similarities with Holyoke, because I believe that Lawrence is, no city is 100% typical, but if you had to pick a city to show this is what happened in the late 20th century, if I could make a time capsule, Lawrence would be the city I would choose to demonstrate the important transformations of the late 20th century. I saw another hand and I missed it. I'm sorry. Yes?
I was wondering if some of your students, I'm not sure exactly what level you're teaching, but are some of your students likely to go on, inspired by your work, and write some other pieces or add to it? Do you see any of that yet?
I teach in New York, and I teach at an undergraduate institution, public. So it's possible. But when I have students who say I want to be a historian, I talk about the job market. So I feel it is my responsibility to encourage their dreams, but also give them some kind of context. So I would love if, the students I teach are incredible, motivated students. Many of them are the first in their family to go to college. I have, a large proportion of undocumented students. I hope that the stories I tell in the classroom motivate them to struggle, and even if it doesn't motivate them to become historians, to recognize that history has something essential to teach us. Yeah, sorry.
I want to add something else. I may not be ready to articulate it, but I spent 2 hours with 90-year-old relatives of mine this afternoon, from noon to 2, in eastern Massachusetts, where I grew up, in an all-white suburb of Boston. And I heard from these white relatives about the discrimination that happened in that town I grew up in. I grew up in a naive bubble, not knowing what was happening. And my 90-year-old cousin was saying that she married him from across the track, from the port, and that was a no-no. And that town, she said, they were terrible with the prejudices. He was followed as a child. The police, if he crossed the road, and he's white, but if he crossed the road and was seen over here, he was just bouncing a tennis ball out. The police were there. If you bounce that ball one more time, I'm sending you to reform school.
Yeah, in jail. In Lawrence, every
So these kind of pressures of an established community to try to exclude the foreigners from the port, even though they weren't very foreign, but it's a class thing.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
As well as the race thing. It's so compounded. And I have heard from my high school classmates different stories from the port area now that I never knew about. I never went to the port. I think my family never would have allowed me there.
Yeah.
It was just unknown to me. There were forces there keeping me in my bubble, and I thought that it just happened to be a white town.
Yeah.
How wrong I was.
Well, one of the reasons, sorry.
Thank you.
One of the reasons why I focus I tell the stories of prejudice and bigotry, but I focus hugely on political economy. I focus hugely on the structural factors that give certain people privileges and opportunities and give other people hardship and struggle, and apartments with no bathtubs, right? I focus on those structural inequalities. That really, if the book is hard to read, it's because of that, right? That I'm really trying to unpack the numbers, the tax information, right? The zoning requirements that create structural inequality. In my mind, what undergirds that is that prejudices are the stories that get told to justify those inequalities. As long as there are inequalities, people will make up stories to explain why some people deserve things that other people don't deserve. Many of the people who were many of the Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, not all, but enough of them who were in Lawrence, if you ask them, well, but what are you, like descent-wise? They say, oh, I'm white, I'm Spanish. And yet, in a U.S. racial context of structural access to white privileges, being Dominican and Puerto Rican and living in Lawrence did not give you access to white privilege. And so whatever identity you might have, however you might conceive of yourself, you don't access the structural privileges that exist. So those prejudices are the way that we as society, or the way that those in power make sense of and justify inequalities. So long as there are inequalities, people will continue to tell those stories to justify them. Yeah.
As a historian, I'm just astonished about how the political economy and the economic component has been wiped out of popular consciousness. So in a city like Holyoke or a city like Lawrence, where people grew up working in factories and could see that was the source of their wealth, they were often part of unions that were able to campaign for better wages, and then we see all the factories go, and the disinvestors are not blamed, but the people who are blamed are the new generation. But we see it all around us in our physical landscape, these humongous structures that 1,500, 2,500, 5,000 people employed, and to not make that connection is really just mind-boggling to me. And a week and a half ago on a Friday night, I think it was Friday or Tuesday, Robert Forrest from Lowell was speaking to us about the rise and fall of the Connecticut River Valley industry with these amazing photographs. And again, just how is that memory lost, or the connections between that was the source of middle class wealth that helped create a white middle class and all these ethnic groups. And of course you're not going to have that when that all disappears and is pulled out from under everyone's feet and taken away. And I think the other thing, though, part of that conversation a week and a half ago also has to do with state policy and minimum wage. I mean, you're talking about a time, 50s, 60s, and 70s when the minimum wage meant a lot more. I mean, working in a textile factory, whether in the 30s or the 60s, was a pretty dismal experience. But the minimum, between the unions and a higher minimum wage, people could be at the verge of a middle-class existence, and if they were white, assume their children would be able to make it into the middle class. And now, because there's nothing inherently bad about service jobs. I mean, if everyone was getting $15 to $20 an hour working at McDonald's and in retail, we'd have a booming economy. And somehow we think that factory jobs are just inherently better, and if we could just get those factory jobs back. But there's also the wage component that is a whole other issue.
Hugely. I mean, and really, again, I absolutely am trying in this work to draw attention to political economy, because I think that the way that we even talk about economics hides more than it reveals to us. Particularly, Lawrence was at the center of the state and then the national efforts to reform welfare. And there was a hyper attention to Lawrence welfare recipients and a stigmatization of people who relied on welfare to make their ends meet. And a sense that was, again, what had ruined Lawrence's economy, the fact that people needed welfare. When the reality was that the money coming in to Lawrence through welfare was then distributed to landlords, to business owners, to doctors, to clinics, right? That ultimately welfare was the major source of revenue in the city. And actually the welfare office relocated to one of the old abandoned mills, right? And so this sense of everyone was talking about the people who relied on welfare to pay their rent, but not talking about the landlords that ultimately ended up with that money, many of whom lived in the surrounding areas. In the same way, and I know that this is a topic that hits close to home, I hear every day, I get my Google alerts on Lawrence every day about Lawrence's stigma as the source of the region's opioids. And yet, you can't sell drugs unless somebody is buying drugs. And now the huge New England marketplace for drugs is never part of the conversation, and people act like Lawrence invented drugs. And it's, it's a way of talking about the economy that doesn't actually talk about anything at all, and just blames and just stigmatizes and just, again, justifies why some people have more and some people have less. And it really ultimately doesn't show us where the money goes. Because if you follow the money, I promise you it flows out of Lawrence, not into it. I know that we're supposed to be wrapping up at 7, so if there's one more question, I'm happy to take it, and otherwise, I will say thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.